We'll force her to transfer the deed and give the beach house to Trenton." I stopped before I turned the corner. My father's voice was low, but there was nothing uncertain about it. 20 feet away, my brother Trenton's wedding reception was still roaring. Music, glasses clinking, people celebrating. And my parents were standing in a quiet terrace hallway deciding what to do with my $725,000 beach house. "She'll fight us at first," Mom said. "But once everyone knows it's supposed to be Trenton's wedding gift, what can she do? Embarrass him in front of the whole family." Dad chuckled. Then Mom said the sentence that changed everything. "Trenton already thinks it's his." My hand tightened around my purse. They hadn't asked me. They had already promised it. And standing there listening, I made a decision neither of them expected. I wasn't going to argue about the deed. I was going to make sure there was no deed left for them to demand. I quietly stepped backward before they could see me and returned to the reception. "My name is Sandra Bennett. I'm 34, and for most of my adult life, I had been the daughter everyone could count on. Usually, that meant pay for. I had built a successful career managing commercial properties, and somewhere along the way, my parents decided my financial stability made me responsible for everyone else's problems, especially Trenton's. At 29, my younger brother had always been their favorite. So when I walked back into the ballroom and saw him laughing beside his new wife, I didn't blame him yet. I didn't even know how much he knew. "Sandra." Trenton pulled me into a hug. "You disappeared." "Just looking for my phone." Across the room, Mom and Dad emerged from the hallway. Dad caught my eye. He smiled. That was the strange part. He looked completely relaxed because he had no idea I had heard him. A photographer called the family together. Mom stood beside Trenton. Dad wrapped an arm around him. I stepped into place and smiled for the camera while one thought kept running through my head. They promised him my house. Later, Dad found me near the reception tables. He hugged me in front of 2 relatives and said, "Tomorrow we need to talk about doing something important for your brother." I looked directly at him. "Sure." His smile widened. He thought that meant yes. I left the wedding early. But I didn't drive home. I drove straight to the beach house. By the time I arrived, it was nearly midnight. I switched on the lights, walked from room to room, and started taking photographs. The kitchen, bedrooms, deck, ocean view. Then I opened my secure property folder and pulled out the deed. My name. Only my name. I called Maya Collins, the broker who had handled several of my investment properties. "Sandra," she answered sleepily, "is everything okay?" "I need an urgent valuation." "On what?" "The beach house. I want a clean sale, Maya, fast. I'm willing to price accordingly." There was a pause. "You're selling the beach house." I stared through the windows at the dark ocean. "Yes." Then I opened another property file sitting beside it. Because what my parents didn't know was that the beach house wasn't the only address I was about to give Maya. My mother called before I even had the chance to meet Maya. "Sandra, come over this morning," she said. "Your father and I need to have a family discussion with you." "A discussion about what?" "You know what it's about." I looked at the beach house documents still spread across my desk. "I'll be there." An hour later, I walked into the house my parents lived in and found Dad waiting at the dining table. Mom had coffee ready, almost as if they were about to negotiate something that belonged to all 3 of us. Dad got straight to it. "Trenton is married now. He wants children. He needs a proper start." Mom nodded. "And you barely use that beach house." I pulled out a chair. "So?" Mom frowned. "Sandra, you're 34. You're financially secure. You have more than you need." There it was. The same argument they had used for years. If I had something and Trenton didn't, somehow keeping it became selfish. Dad leaned forward. "The beach house would give your brother and his wife stability. You can always buy another property." I studied their faces. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Did you already tell Trenton I was giving him my house? Silence. Mom looked at Dad. Dad cleared his throat. We told him you'd do the right thing. So yes. Don't twist this, Mom snapped. Do you have any idea what parents sacrifice for their children? Your brother is starting from nothing, and you're sitting on a second home worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I slowly looked around their kitchen. New cabinets. Stone countertops. Beyond the window was the landscaped yard I had helped maintain. They lived here without paying rent. I covered the property taxes, insurance, and major repairs. Yet sitting at my table, inside my property, they were explaining why I owed them another house. Dad pushed his chair back. We want the transfer paperwork started this week. I stood. I heard you. That wasn't an agreement, but neither of them noticed the difference. Outside, I walked to my car and immediately called Maya. About last night, I said, add another property. Which one? I looked back at the house. The residence my parents are living in. Maya went silent. Sandra, your parents live there. I know. You're asking me to prepare it for an off-market sale. Yes, qualified buyers only. Everything handled legally and discreetly. You're certain? I watched my father through the front window, already talking animatedly to Mom. Completely. Before my parents had even finished telling relatives about Trenton's wedding gift, I authorized Maya to begin finding buyers for both houses. 2 days later, I walked into our post-wedding family brunch and discovered exactly how my parents planned to force my hand. Trenton spotted me first. Sandra, perfect timing. He came over smiling, with several relatives close enough to hear. My wife and I were talking about the beach house last night, he said. That smaller bedroom upstairs would make an amazing nursery. I stared at him. Nursery. Eventually, he laughed. She already has renovation ideas, nothing crazy. We'd probably redo the floors first. Before I could answer, my aunt touched my arm. Sandra, giving Trenton that house is incredibly generous. Across the table, Dad was watching me. He smiled. Suddenly, I understood the plan perfectly. They had told enough people that the beach house was Trenton's wedding gift, that correcting the lie would make me look like the person taking something away. I turned back to my brother. Trenton, who told you I was giving you my house. The conversations around us stopped. His smile disappeared. Mom and Dad. Mom immediately stepped forward. We said it was what made sense for everyone. No, I said calmly. You told him it was happening. Dad's expression hardened. I looked at Trenton. Nobody should make plans around property they don't own. I picked up my purse and walked outside. Dad followed me. Sandra. The moment the door closed behind us, his polite expression vanished. What was that? The truth. You embarrassed your mother and me in front of everyone. You promised away my house. He lowered his voice. Stop being difficult. If you refuse now, everyone in that room is going to think you're selfish. My phone vibrated. A message from Maya. Serious cash-backed offer received. Buyer prepared for rapid closing after inspection and title work. I read it twice. Dad was still talking. You need to call Trenton tonight and tell him we're starting the deed transfer. I slipped my phone back into my purse and looked directly at him. Dad, you should probably stop making promises with my addresses. By the next morning, my phone barely stopped ringing. Mom called 4 times before 9. Dad left messages demanding that I fix what I'd done at brunch. Then Trenton called. Sandra, are you seriously backing out of this? I never agreed to it. But Mom and Dad said. Then you need to talk to Mom and Dad. I ended the call without arguing over a house that was legally mine. While my family was trying to pressure me back into obedience, Maya was moving forward. The beach house buyer completed the inspection. Title work came back clean. The buyer had the funds and wanted to close quickly. Meanwhile, Maya had quietly found an investor interested in the second property, the house where my parents lived. He understands it's occupied, Maya told me. Possession and notice have to be handled properly. Good, no shortcuts. I wasn't going to change locks overnight or throw my parents onto the sidewalk. Everything would be documented, lawful, and handled through the sale terms and required notice. That mattered to me. Because my parents had one weapon, pressure. Their names weren't on my beach house deed. They weren't on the deed to their residence either. They could guilt me, embarrass me, call relatives, and make promises, but they couldn't legally transfer what they didn't own. The beach house closed first. I was sitting in my office when Maya sent confirmation. Recorded, sale complete. I stared at those words. The $725,000 property my parents had already promised Trenton now belonged to someone else. There was nothing left to transfer. Then came the second closing. I reviewed the documents one final time and signed. The house my parents had treated as permanently theirs was sold too. Later that day, Dad called. Sandra. Mom was shouting somewhere behind him. What happened? I asked. What did you do? Before he could continue, I heard a loud knock through the phone. Dad stopped speaking. Another knock. Then muffled voices. When he came back on the line, all the authority had disappeared from his voice. Sandra, he said, suddenly shaken, there's a man here saying this house has been sold. I drove to my parents' house that afternoon. Dad was waiting in the dining room with the sale paperwork spread across the table. Mom stood beside him, pale and furious. The second I walked in, Dad grabbed the papers. How could you sell our home? I put my purse down. It was never your home. Mom stared at me. Excuse me. You lived here. You never owned it. Dad slapped the paperwork onto the table. We've been here for years. And whose name is on the deed? Neither of them answered. Years earlier, my parents had been in serious financial trouble and were about to lose their previous home. I had stepped in because I couldn't stand the thought of them having nowhere stable to live. I bought this house myself. I never transferred ownership. They lived here rent-free, while I paid the property taxes, insurance, and major maintenance. They knew that. But after years of living without rent, they had stopped treating my help like generosity. They treated it like an entitlement. Then they decided the beach house belonged to the family too. Mom gripped the back of a chair. You sold this because we asked you to help your brother. No, I sold it because I heard you at the wedding. Her face changed. Dad went still. I repeated his words. We'll force her to transfer the deed and give the beach house to Trenton. Mom's mouth opened, but nothing came out. And then you said Trenton already thought it was his. Dad stared at me. You heard us. Every word. For the first time, they understood why I hadn't argued. They thought my silence meant surrender. It meant I was making decisions. The front door opened a few minutes later. Trenton came in furious. You sold it. Yes. You knew we were planning to move there. I turned toward him. When did I ever tell you it was yours? He started to answer, then stopped. I waited. Nothing. Finally, he looked at Mom. You told me Sandra had agreed. Mom shook her head. We said she would agree. No, Trenton said. You told us we could start planning. Dad tried to interrupt, but Trenton stepped away from him. That was the moment the lie stopped being mine to defend against. It became theirs to explain. I looked at my brother. I don't blame you for believing your parents, but I'm not replacing a $725,000 house because they promised you something they didn't own. The beach house sale remained final. So did this one. My parents received the proper notice required under the sale and enough time to arrange their move. I gave them information for several affordable rentals because I wasn't interested in making them homeless. But when Mom asked whether I could simply buy them another place, my answer was one word: no. For years, they had lived without rent. Now they had to budget for housing like everyone else. The relatives who had called me selfish after the brunch eventually learned what had actually happened. My parents had never owned either property, and I had never agreed to give Trenton the beach house. The criticism disappeared quickly after that. Trenton and his wife abandoned their renovation plans. Months later, he admitted he should have spoken directly to me before building his future around something he had never been offered. I accepted that, but I changed something permanently too. No more houses. No more loans. No more financial rescues disguised as proof that I loved my family. I invested part of the proceeds from both sales and eventually bought a smaller coastal condo in another town. The first evening I spent there, I sat outside watching the water with the deed safely filed inside. Only one name was on it: mine. My relationship with my parents became more distant, but also much simpler. They could disagree with my choices. They could complain about them. What they could no longer do was control me through things I paid for. My parents wanted to decide who deserved my beach house, so I finally stopped giving them houses to decide anything about.